Hi, Hazel. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's been such a beautiful day. I was outside for a good
No,
portion of it.
this whole week has just been super lovely.
I know. Yes,
Ideal for some family outdoor learning.
exactly. I saw your Facebook post with the hermit thrush nest and
Yeah.
eggs.
Uh-huh.
So exciting. And I haven't
Yeah.
replied yet, but this morning I had a similar moment of excitement because I found a dark-eyed junco nest in our garden.
Cool.
Yeah,
What do their eggs look like?
they're quite small and white with light brown speckles.
Cool. I've never seen those before. I didn't know that hermit thrushes had blue eggs at all, and only knew because I saw a hermit thrush fly away from the nest.
Exactly. That was the
Yeah.
same thing for me with the dark-eyed junco.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Jake. Welcome.
How's it going? Happy afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, Hazel. I'm Jake.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
Lander, did you enjoy the sun today?
I did. Hazel and I were just talking about how beautiful it's been, and I was telling her I was so excited because I found a dark-eyed junco nest in my garden this morning and had
Oh,
4 beautiful little eggs, and I scared the mom away, and then I have figured out where it is, and I'm not going to disturb her after this, but it was pretty cool.
until about a month ago, I would not have known what that was, but I do now.
Yeah, cool.
Learning every day.
Yes, me too. Did you have a good day, Jake?
I did. I didn't get to spend as much time as I would have loved outside, but I think now that the beautiful weather is kind of coming to Maine, that's going to just happen more and more. So it's just the way it is.
Absolutely.
Until they make glare-proof computer screens, I don't see me getting outside as much as I'd ever like. So
I know.
I know. Sometimes I have a backpacking screen house, and sometimes I set it up in my yard. And I can last out there until like my battery dies, or sometimes I'll get an extension cord. It's an undertaking though, to get the screen house up and then get an extension cord and be close enough that I can still have internet, but it's totally worth it sometimes.
Good for you.
it's totally worth it when you get it right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Lander, how many folks registered for this one? Do we know?
We have 26 people registered so far. I
Wow.
believe a few people wanted to attend but can't, and so we'll view the recording. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. It's awesome. Hazel, do you feel set on your end?
I do. Yeah. I think I'm ready.
Wonderful. We'll give it another like 2-3 minutes. I think we have 3 people who are with us. Hi, everybody. And then we can get started. I'll do a little introduction, and I think Jake has something he's going to say, and then we'll pass it on to you.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Sounds good. Lander, I'll share those questions that you sent to me with the group now.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake.
I'll just put them in there, and then I'll reference them in a couple of minutes. But that way they're there before I get going and forget about it.
Perfect. Those are the ones that Hazel sent me. So thank you, Hazel, for those icebreakers.
Oh, good.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. We'll just forward them around in circles forever.
Yep.
This to everybody.
And Hazel, something that we found out last webinar that I wasn't aware of anyway with this platform is that the panelists can see the chat box so long as your screen isn't up. But I think if your screen is filling your computer, you can't see the chat box. So just something to keep in mind.
That is good to know.
Monitor the chat box for you.
Yeah, cool.
And Lander, we're going to save these icebreakers for the end as kind of like prompt questions. Is that?
Yeah, or if people want to respond to them, I guess, in the chat box during the presentation. Hazel, were you thinking they would be kind of something that people could just respond to in the chat box, or was that something And then people can ask questions about your presentation at the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, I think it says 4 p.m. on my computer. Is that correct?
F4 as well.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us. And I think we have a few more people who will log on shortly. This is our 4th webinar in the series Friends from the Field that Blue Hill Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust have been co-hosting for the last month, which is so cool. And stay tuned for another month of webinars. We'll be getting a flyer out soon on the Blue Heritage Trust website as well as Island Heritage Trust website for some new topics coming up. So my name is Lander, if you don't know me, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And I'm going to pass it over to Jake to do a little technology housekeeping before I introduce our guest today.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Jake from Island Heritage Trust. I'm representing the whole organization. We're so happy to be a part of this, and a big thank you to Lander and everyone over at Blue Hill Heritage Trust. This is such an exciting thing, and especially during this time, it's so important to stay connected. There is or was a raise your hand feature, but we're going to save that for the end. If Hazel has any prompting questions, please feel free to answer in the chat box, but we will save a little end segment where there'll be question opportunities for Hazel. And with further ado, I'll hand it back over to Lander to do the formal introduction.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. So today we have with us Hazel Stark. She is the co-founder of Maine Outdoor School, and she's also the co-chief executive officer. She's a naturalist educator and a registered Maine guide. Thank you, Hazel, so much for being with us. We're very excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think this is a really exciting opportunity for folks to be able to access these kinds of opportunities online. It's kind of fun to see how these things have developed during all these COVID cancellations, and would be actually exciting to continue regardless of COVID to have online accessible resources. So thank you to Blue Hill Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust for teaming up to make this possible. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen in a moment to be able to have some pictures and just some guiding words to carry us through our family outdoor learning today. So I'm going to do that now so my face will get smaller. Here we go. All right. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, I'm in full screen mode, so Jake and Lander, let me know if somebody says something on the chat that I can't see. So today I'm going to go over some family outdoor learning ideas for grades 5 and up. And when I say and up, I really mean through adulthood. These are all going to be things that adults can totally do. And also people who are under grade 5 can also do most of these activities with just some minor modifications. You'll see that all of the ample modifications in them. So hopefully they get you some ideas, whether you're a teacher or a parent or a kid yourself, to get outside and learning. So here's what we're going to cover today. First, what to observe in nature now. So we'll do a little bit of what is phenology and what can we be looking at in nature right now. Then we're going to go into some particular structures and prompts for tying into science and language arts. Then we'll go a little bit further to extend our backyard observations into other subjects as well. And then at the end, I've reserved a chunk of time so that we can have some questions and answers, so that if folks are wanting other ideas that I haven't covered based on a particular cool thing in your backyard, we could brainstorm about that. Or if you have questions along the way, hold on to those and I'll be happy to answer those at the end as well. So I'm going to dive into phenology. And again, Lander and Jake, feel free to interrupt at any point if there's anything that comes up in the chat. But phenology is one of those words that not a lot of people know, but everybody pays attention to phenology, whether they know the word or not. So basically, phenology is the timing of natural occurrences throughout the seasons. So if you're somebody who pays attention to when the first crocus blooms in your yard, or when you notice the first turkey vulture returning, that is an example of a phenology observation. So phenology lends itself really well to outdoor learning, because it's all about paying attention to the changes in the natural world around us and starting to notice some trends. And starting a phenology observation practice in the spring is a really good time, because there's so much going on that you never feel like you have to look around and try to find something. So now's a really good time. So there is a ton going on in nature right now. I'm only going to talk quickly about these 4 examples, because I could spend a whole hour or more talking about what to be looking for in nature. But here are 4 that are common in Maine to start looking for, and maybe launch some of the projects or ideas that I'm going to mention later from. So the first is bluets. Bluets are a tiny little wildflower. They're only about 2 inches high. They have 4 petals and a yellow center, and they're really common in lawns and fields and even ditches, and they usually grow in clumps. So pretty much no matter where you are in Maine right now, you can pretty easily find bluets. So they can be a really fun thing to track: how long they flower, when they start, when they end, and you can build all sorts of projects from those. Wild strawberries are also flowering right now and will transform into fruit soon, but not yet. So they're still flowering along in the same kinds of places that bluets grow: lawns and fields, really close to the ground. Sometimes you have to kind of peek under the grass to find them. And then hobblebush is another one. This is a bigger shrub. And it will grow in areas that are more forested. So if you're going on a hike at either a Blue Hill Heritage Trust or Island Heritage Trust preserve, I've got to believe there's some hobblebush in a bunch of those preserves, because they do like sort of moist woodlands, or on your way up a mountain, they like that as well. Hobblebush is kind of fun because their leaves are really big. They can be like over 6 inches wide, and their flower heads, you can see in this picture, they have tiny little green kind of inconspicuous flowers in the middle, and then they have big white showy flowers around the outside, and those big white showy flowers are actually fake flowers. They just are there to attract pollinators to the real flowers, which are the little green things in the middle. So those are pretty fun, and the leaves can be used for leaf rubbings, which I'll talk about later. And then lastly, there is shadbush. So if you're driving around right now and see any sort of tree, they tend not to get very big as trees, but they're trees nonetheless, with white flowers all over them, it's probably shadbush. Shadbush has a lot of different common names. They're also called serviceberry or Juneberry, so you might know them by that name. Their genus is Amelanchier, so you might be familiar with that too. They have a lot of names. There's a lot of different species of Amelanchier or shadbush too, but most of them are flowering right now, and they're a really fun example of phenology because they're called shadbush because when they bloom is also when shad, a type of fish, runs in our rivers. So if you pay attention to when shad is blooming, you might consider going to your nearby river to fish for shad if it's legal to do that there. So phenology, as I said, is a really good launching off point for all sorts of different projects. So we're going to go into a few of those next. So some resources sometimes can really help, and there's a lot of phenology resources out there to consider. So I'm going to talk through the ones that are on the screen so you can see whether any of them feel like something that sort of works for you, that seems interesting for you. Of course, you don't need to use these resources in Phenology Observer, but they can help, and they can also help you contribute your phenology observations to scientists that would actually use it. So the first one here is iNaturalist. This is an app. It's also a website, but I tend to use it on the app. And it gives you the opportunity to take a photo of something that you notice in nature. So that could be a flower, it could be a bird, it could even be scat. a mushroom, really anything. And then you can upload your photo and be able to put it up in iNaturalist and identify it if you know what it is. But if you don't know what it is, iNaturalist can sometimes guess for you based on the picture. And I've actually been really surprised how good iNaturalist is at identifying plants correctly. I know plants pretty well, so sometimes I test out iNaturalist and upload it and see whether it's actually a correct ID, and usually it does a pretty good job. You can also, if you don't know and you don't want to necessarily trust iNaturalist's identification, you can allow other folks can comment and identify what you found for you. So this can be really helpful to help you learn new species if that's interesting to you. And it's also data that different scientists use to actually create bigger phenology projects or other projects about where different species are in the world. So this is an international app where people are uploading their observations all over the place. I really liked it because last year, I don't know if it was just last year, it kind of seemed like it. There were a lot of caterpillars around in August and September, more than I ever remember. I was seeing them everywhere. And I don't know my caterpillars very well, so I was doing a lot of uploading caterpillar pictures to iNaturalist, and all these people would comment on what kinds of caterpillars they were. So I learned a lot about different caterpillars just because I had the iNaturalist app. So that was pretty helpful to sort of spur kind of tracking your own calendar in that way. So the next one is the USA National Phenology Network. So they have a lot of resources on their website, so you can definitely check that out on your own. But one particular one to mention is Nature's Notebook. So this is one, if you're a person who wants to go out and set up your own plot or really get invested in a project that already has a procedure for you and spelled out, Nature's Notebook is a good option for that. So it can be as simple as setting up a plot in your backyard or just focusing on a dandelion or pollinators. They have a bunch of different types. And so this is, again, another one where you can actually make observations using a procedure that already exists and contribute the observations that you make to real scientists that will use that data. And I'll also, Maine Cooperative Extension recently announced that they're training in their Signs of the Seasons program, which also does Nature's Notebook. They have a free online training for Signs of the Seasons available right now. So that website is there if you want to check that out and go through an actual training experience to really become master phenology observers through their program. So another couple last resources to know about for phenology. One is a radio show that I co-produce for WERU community radio station. It's called The Nature of Phenology, and it's just a 5-minute episode where every week we go into a particular species or concept that you observe in nature now in this area. And so, for example, like last weekend was all about hobblebush. I think that was last weekend, was all about hobblebush and how it's flowering and some cool features about hobblebush. We also put all the transcripts and links to the audio archives through our blog, thenatureofphenology.wordpress.com, if you want to read them there or listen to past episodes. We also include photos, which of course you can't see on the radio. So if you're wanting to actually see what we're talking about, you can see photos. And I've had teachers that I work with use this as a sort of launching our off point for different ages of students to listen for if they're learning about nature writing, they can try to be inspired about writing or just what's going on outside and something to look for and pay attention to. So that's another resource to know about. And then the last phenology resource to share is really just it's a bird identification app. So this is through the Cornell lab. It's called the Merlin app. It is a free app, which is nice. So is iNaturalist. It's a really good one because it allows you to identify birds pretty well. So it'll ask you basically 5 questions about when you saw the bird, how big the bird was, what its colors are, and also what it was doing, I think, and then gives you a bunch of options based on where you are and the time of year about what bird it might have been. So this can make bird identification a lot more tangible for folks who might feel a bit overwhelmed by a big field guide that might have all of the birds in the Northeast or all the birds on the Eastern Seaboard. It helps narrow it down, which can be really helpful. So if you're interested in identifying birds, that's a good one to check out. So I'll take a quick pause here before I dive into some journal prompts in case there's anything from the chat or any come up, because some things came up for me. Let's see. Oh, look, you're sharing some great links. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Cool. All right. Oops. I just skipped way ahead. All right. So next, we're going to go into some prompts and structures for science connections to whether it's launching off from some phenology observations or anything else. So, not liking me going forward. Here we go. All right. So again, I'll say Nature's Notebook. When I think about science connections for families wanting to learn outdoors together, I always think it's really important to have some kind of relevant project. It's definitely relevant if it's something you're interested in, of course, but if you're having to push a little bit to go outside and actually do something science-based, having something that really matters can often be a good motivator, especially for older students. And so actually engaging with projects like Nature's Notebook out there where scientists really will use your data to understand things about the world can be really motivating, that no matter your age, you can be a contributing scientist. That's really helpful. So contributing things through iNaturalist, through Nature's Notebook, and UMaine's Signs of the Seasons, those are all different ways to make your science observations and data you collect really relevant, which can be really motivating. Another way to collect data, so perhaps you and your family are not excited about like doing formal data collection and submitting those to real tests or whatever, that's totally fine. There's other ways to collect data and do that in a way that's fun and still engaging and a good learning experience. So sound maps are one of my favorite ways of doing that. Sound maps basically have you go outside to a spot where you can listen, which is pretty much anywhere. And you take out a piece of paper, you draw yourself. So I have a smiley face in the middle of this one to represent myself, but you could get really artsy and like really draw a good self-portrait. So that's in the center of the sound map. And then you just sit quietly and listen to the different sounds you hear around you and essentially map that out. So perhaps you hear a car way off in the distance. So you could draw a car at the very edge of your map. And then you hear a bird somewhere between that car and you. So you draw those birds in between on your map. So you keep recording you hear, whether it's a human sound or a nature sound. And then by the end of it, you actually have a visual map of the sounds that you heard. This can be one of those things where you do this at different times throughout a day and see whether the sounds change from morning to midday to the evening. Or you could do it every Monday or the first Monday of the month to make it a little bit more spread out. After you've done this a few times, you have some pretty interesting data for yourself to consider, did all the sounds stay the same depending on the time of day or what month it was, or did they change? Did I only hear this one sound in the morning versus in the middle of the day? And so this can be another, just like phenology observations, this can be a great launching off point for different projects, whether it's a research paper or a different science project, because you're collecting some data, you're making observations, and usually questions come about from this kind of a process. It also can just be a fun way to get to observe your own back in a way that we aren't used to. Usually humans tend to rely a lot on our sense of sight, and sometimes it's good to practice using our other senses a little bit more deeply and see what new things we can learn about that. So tracking changes in the same spot over time, of course, you can do that with a sound map, but you can do that in any number of ways. You could draw what you have noticed in one particular spot. You could write what you're noticing in list form or as a poem or something like that. And you can make your spot really big or really small. So you could actually create a plot in your own backyard where you just return to that same spot over time and see what has changed in that spot. You could do this by taking photos as well. You can also really do a good job of just sitting in the same spot and seeing how much you see around you, something like that, to expand your spot a little bit more. But again, really diving into your observations and using all your senses, though. In my programs, I tend to refer to my science senses, my 4 science senses, rather than all 5 senses, because I don't recommend people randomly tasting things outdoors. So using all senses but taste can be a good thing to practice. But diving in through things like sound maps or smelling that same spot over time and writing down what it smelled like, looking at it, of course, listening, or touching it too. Like, does it always feel the same in this particular spot at different times of day or different months? For example, is it always damp in the morning and always dry in the middle of the day? Things like that. So those can also be really valuable pieces of data for science, and also just interesting to notice trends in your own backyard as well. Okay, so one of the next sort of concepts when we're thinking about science and having sort of structures for science projects is the science circle. I was first introduced to this at Teton Science Schools, but it exists in other places too, but I really like their sort of graphic to go along with it. Many of you may already be familiar with the scientific method. That is basically a linear sort of set of steps where you observe something and then you have a question. So for the sound map, maybe you made an observation about a certain bird that you're hearing at the same time every day, but not in the afternoon, only in the morning. So you might start to wonder, I wonder if that particular bird is, is a robin or is something, I don't know. And then you might make a guess that bird is a robin. And then you might want to design some kind of a project to help you figure out what that bird was that you're always hearing in case you can't see it. So then you might say, well, if I want to figure that out, I'm going to need to maybe get binoculars. I might need to stay out a little bit earlier than I hear it so I can be there when it starts singing, and then maybe get my eyes on it. Then you actually go and try to get your eyes on it, collect that data, you write down what you're noticing about that bird, and what both how it looks, what it's doing, and then you can start using some resources, whether that's field guides or an app like Merlin, to help you identify it, and then actually analyze what you figured out. So that's a very basic version of using the science circle. But most importantly, it's a circle because once you've gotten to the end and you've said, yes, that was a robin, or actually my hypothesis was wrong, that was a junco or something. It becomes a science circle when you actually share what you discovered, whether that's within your family as a presentation with each other, or writing a letter or an email to someone to say, hey, I did this project, I learned this thing about my backyard. What kind of birds do you have in your backyard? And then you continue to make observations in that place and can continue going through the science circle, because usually you get to the end of a project and you say, that was actually a junco. I wonder what their eggs look like. Lander was just saying that she had seen a junco nest this morning. So you might wonder, I wonder what their eggs look like, or I wonder where they nest. And you might go through the science circle again to go into a little bit more depth about that particular topic that you dove into. So it's a circle. You can keep going around and around forever, but it provides some great structure to actually making sure you're going through it methodically and not really skipping any steps. Okay, so now is time for some language arts connections. So I've mentioned some already around doing some writing or poetry as you go along. The outdoors is really inherently interdisciplinary, so it's hard not to do a bunch of different subjects at once. So let's just focus on language arts though for now. So research papers, of course, are an easy tie-in to whether it's a sound map, phenology observations, using the science circle, and of course can be tiered depending on the age level of what level of detail and research you put into them. But of course, with research papers, they're always more exciting when they're about what you're interested in. And we tend to be a lot more interested in things that we have experienced and observed hands-on. So that backyard learning can be really valuable for research papers. I kind of think about my Nature of Phenology radio show as my opportunity to write some little mini research papers, because they're always based on my observations and what I've noticed, but they offer me the opportunity to dive in a little bit more and learn more about whatever that concept or species is. So I learn something every single time I write one of those, and that's really motivating for me. So having a research paper that comes right out of one of those observations about that junco. So say you've gone through the science circle a few times related to that junco that you identified and figured out where they nest and all of that. And part of that sharing, beyond maybe giving a presentation to your family or writing a letter to a loved one to share, could be actually writing up a more formal research paper that includes the resources that you use to find out about that creature, or whatever else you want to throw in there. And so there's lots of ways to really deepen the learning opportunity through just a simple backyard observation. Okay, so naturalist writers are next. Naturalist writer a lot. I've only just a few here so that you can just have some ideas going through your brain. So the reason I mention naturalist writers is for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, you can read their work and do analysis of what they wrote. This is a mix of folks from modern day to a while ago, like Thoreau was around in the late 1800s. And it gives you an opportunity to both analyze their writing, but also an interesting opportunity to try to mimic writing. So they themselves can serve as their own prompt. And so like Rachel Carson, for example, all of her naturalist writing was really focused on having a conservation message. Terry Tempest Williams is similar. And so the opportunity to sort of analyze where she was coming from in whether it's Silent Spring or more of her ocean-focused books, you can analyze that, but also try to mimic how she gets across a conservation message about something in your own backyard that you think should be conserved, for example. Similarly, like Pablo Neruda, he writes a lot of poetry. And so you could be inspired by his poetry and then go out and try to write a poem in his style about something in nature in your own backyard. This kind of mimicking can be really helpful for folks who, when told to just go out and write, feel a little bit like there are way too many options out there. So that's why it helps to have that little bit of structure and inspiration to have some kind of path to go to. If you or your family are people who are like, nope, I don't need prompts, I don't need to be inspired by somebody to write, great. But some people definitely do, and so that can help. Thoreau is another one where his writing style is pretty different from modern day writers in that he doesn't use a lot of punctuation and his sentences go on forever. And so it can be really interesting to try to mimic that and see if you can make it sound good. And just really analyze how writing has evolved and writing about people has evolved, that kind of thing. And and Robin Wall Kimmerer is maybe my favorite naturalist writer. She does a really good job in books like Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss of blending natural history information with personal lived experience and really walking some really interesting lines and of analogy between the natural world and the human world, and how not very separate those two sort of realms are. So she's another one. She's from New York and she's a modern writer. So those are a few people to consider. There are so many others out there, but again, they can inspire types of writing. They can also teach you about things in the natural world as well. It can be interesting to read naturalist writers from other places too, like from the desert, where we don't have deserts around here, and so it can be interesting to learn about a different ecosystem and give you an opportunity to compare as well. Okay, so moving into some other subjects. So we've covered a bunch of options for science projects. We've covered some options for language arts, writing and reading. So let's dive into just a little bit of math and engineering and art before we close it out today. And I'll provide some other resources and options for questions too. So for math and engineering, starting with math, the opportunity to count and graph is a really good one and really easy to do in nature, and a lot more engaging than, just counting how many, buttons you can find on the floor or something like that. You can find a lot more in nature that can be interesting. So one of the ways to structure that a little bit is the number of living things in one spot over time. So if you did like the idea of creating your own plot in your own backyard to go back to regularly and engage in a science project on, or writing, or whatever it is, you could also be regularly counting the number of living things in one spot over time. It could be the number of different organisms, the number of different species, whatever tier you're at in terms of knowing what's there, just counting what's there and seeing if it changes throughout the course of a day, a week, a month, or even a year. And then you can actually graph that out and be able to more visually see how that changed over the number of things in my spot increase over the course of the day. Did it decrease in the winter and have a lot more things in the summer? It again is a great launching off point to writing a research paper or asking some more questions, going through the science circle to really learn more about that spot. Another sort of count and graph idea is around shadow length. So this one is actually one of my favorites because it helps people understand why seasons happen. And so it can be, and it also practices measuring and graphing all at once with data collection. So basically, all you have to do for this one is head outside and find something that casts a shadow, preferably not a super long shadow like a big tall tree. It could be a sibling who isn't in the middle of a growth spurt. It could be your mailbox, it could be a fence post, something that you can reliably look at outside. And you can measure that shadow length, write down the date, and most importantly, do that multiple times at the same time of day. So if the first time you measure that shadow, it's 1 p.m., always measure the shadow at 1 p.m. And then over time, 1 month is a good minimum, but more than that is even better, especially if you can span one of the solstices. Can be really interesting to see how shadows grow and then shrink. And then you can make some connections about the first day of summer and whether my shadow actually started shrinking after that or growing after that. What happened? And you can make guesses. And I definitely encourage you with these with kids to say, hey, let's try this project. What do you think is going to happen before they start collecting the data? And then actually write that down and then compare once they've figured it out what actually happened compared to what they thought would happen. And so shadow length is a really tangible one that can happen anywhere. and can be really interesting to see how that changes, and is really conducive to a graph to see a shadow grow and then decrease, and then at what date did it start to get shorter. So that's a good one. For engineering, the opportunity to build is a really good one. And I like to have everything be really place-based. So if you have something in your backyard, like your resident porcupine, or that junco, or carpenter ants or something, you can try to get creative to think about what kind of habitat would that creature need? What kind of shelter would that creature need within that habitat? And so getting a little creative and imaginative here to build that using natural objects outdoors, to build that habitat, to build that shelter based on what you guess it would need. Or then afterwards or beforehand, you can do more research about what kind of habitat does a porcupine need? What kind of shelter would a porcupine need? And then actually build it based on what you learn about it. But I actually really like doing especially for younger kids, doing the imaginative thing, like what do you think they would need? Now create that. Now we can learn about what they really do need. And if you want to make modifications, great. But otherwise, it's still a good learning opportunity to just have a chance to imagine. And so that can be a great thing to do, and sort of hones into the desire that all kids have to build stuff with sticks. And that has extra learning results built in there, even though play on its own is super valuable anyway. Okay, so moving into art. I mentioned leaf rubbings at the beginning. Leaf rubbings are a great place to start. I tend to start the youngest kids with this, but it's still really valuable for kids grades 5 and up. Because you can add things like labels to the different parts that you notice. But basically, to make a good leaf rubbing is you take a leaf, really one that has pretty strong veins in it. Sometimes, I'm trying to think, like a clovers kind of work, but if you had like a single clover leaflet, it wouldn't be very exciting. But something like certain ferns, dandelion leaves work well, hobblebush leaves work really well. You put that leaf on a hard surface and then put a piece of paper on top of it. And then using a crayon works really well. You just really crayon all over that paper on top of the leaf. And you get these really cool impressions, like you can see with the student of mine who did this fern rubbing. And you can really see that leaf pop in a way that can be hard for some people to reproduce from drawing. And then for older students, the opportunity to practice botanical vocabulary. So, what's the petiole? What's the veins? What's that structure like? Was it oppositely arranged or alternately arranged? And just describing it. If you don't know the official vocabulary, that's okay. You can just describe, was the edge really smooth or was it kind of sharp? Those kinds of things. And you can build from that in a really nice way. And similarly, making a model of something you observed. So you could make a model of that deer that you saw walk through your yard. Maybe you didn't get to get a picture of it or have time to draw it, but you could make a model of it using leaves and sticks that you find. It could be a 2D kind of a model like these students did, or it could be bigger, like a big 3D sculpture. And that can really inspire some cool imagination and really getting to know your backyard a little bit better, which can be fun. The next one, which is the last art example, I think, is going back to phenology. So we're kind of going full circle with a phenology example here. So here are a couple of templates for phenology journaling with a really focused art bent. So on the left, you'll see that the circle is broken up into 7 slices of pie. So one for every day of the week. So yesterday, for example, I went for a walk and I saw gold thread and wood anemone flowering, some hermit thrush eggs in a nest, and shadbush flowering. So at the end of the day, Wednesday, I could sit down and say, what was the one thing or couple of things that really highlighted the phenology of today for me? And I could draw in that slice of pie that gold thread flower, or that shadbush flower, or those hermit thrush eggs. And then today, and then last night I noticed some bats, and so I might actually add some bats in. And then today I've been really noticing a lot of honeybees on dandelions. So then for Thursday, I might just draw a dandelion with a honeybee on it. And then throughout the course of the week, you have this full circle of drawings that illustrate the phenology throughout the week. And if you do this week for a while, it can be interesting to see how your observations changed, whether you had any repeats, whether you at a certain point stopped seeing the shadbush flowers and started seeing something else. It also can be, it also can be overwhelming to do one drawing a day. So I have the alternative, which works for busier folks, or folks who just like want one commitment a month. So this is a monthly phenology circle where you pay attention to your phenology observations throughout the month, perhaps through taking notes or through the different like sound maps or whatever that you might try. And then at the end of the month, you look back at your phenology observations and think, what was the one thing that for me really defined the season this month, or really sort of emphasized my experiences observing nature this month? And you can draw that one thing for the month and then repeat every month. And by the end of the year, you have this really beautiful circle that shows the cycle of how the seasons changed. And it can be really interesting if you choose to use color to see if the colors change throughout your circle throughout the year, whether you start to notice any patterns throughout it. And it can be really inspiring too, if you do this multiple years, to see if you're always noticing shadbush in May, but the climate's warming, what if shadbush starts actually blooming or staying blooming like a little bit earlier than that, or later? You can start to see if things shift a little bit through this. So again, really valuable data, but also is just a really good opportunity to be creative and apply some art concepts as well. So just a few other resources to mention before I turn it over to Q&A. One is the Maine Outdoor School YouTube channel. So my work at Maine Outdoor School primarily has been, up in COVID-19, is going into schools to provide outdoor educational opportunities to students in their own schoolyards or in local preserves, and connecting to school standards depending on what teachers want. So it's always been, we always do really custom outdoor education. And as Lander mentioned, we're guides, so we're able to do guided nature hikes or inland paddling that also teach people about the natural world, and teacher trainings and that kind of thing. But with COVID, we can't do these in-person things, these hands-on in-person things that we usually do. So I've been working on creating some very short, most of these videos are only 3 or 4 minutes long, kind of interactive videos for the different school groups that I've been working with this spring remotely. And so if you're looking for other ideas of what to be looking for outside and different questions to consider or activities to try, you can check out Maine Outdoor School's YouTube channel, where we have some sort of nature scavenger hunts that have you looking for different life cycle stages of flowering plants, or a couple of common flowers to look for. There's also a series on the food chain, and the food chain one is a 5th grade science standard in particular. So that one is really well tied into that particular grade level. But as I said, with all of these, there's always more that all of us can learn about the outdoors. So that's one to try. Also in March, I wrote an article for the Bangor Daily News that has more ideas. So 6 educational outdoor family activities to try during the pandemic. So that's another place to look. Some of the ones I've mentioned today, but there's several that I wrote in that article that I did not mention today. So they have further instructions for that as well. The one other thing is that coming up next week, if phenology gets you really excited, which I hope it does, it obviously gets me very excited. They're one of our partner organizations, Women for Healthy Rural Living, based here in Millbridge. We're going to be releasing a phenology journaling video that goes into a lot more depth around phenology journaling and gives you a bunch more templates for phenology journaling as well. It includes those circle templates, but it includes a bunch of other types of templates for phenology journaling as well that really anybody of any age can try out. So that'll be published out in the world on Tuesday, so keep your eyes out for that. So with all of that said, I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Hazel. So I think the Q&A should be opened, and we had one answered question from the beginning. So now is a great time to submit any further questions for Hazel. And Lander, is the raise your hand option still available for people if they choose?
It's a good question. Interestingly enough, I'm not seeing it on my end.
Okay.
If anyone who is a participant can see the raise the hand button. Oh yes, I do see it now. Sorry about that.
Oh, good.
Okay. Let's see. Anybody raising their hand? I'm just doing a quick scan. It looks like there is a hand raised. My computer's being a little bit slow. If you did raise your hand and want to re-raise it, I think it may have disappeared from my screen, or you can put your question in the chat box. Meanwhile, Hazel, I had a question. If you have, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. So many tips and tricks to help us all outside and even just bring our daily walks to a whole new level.
Yeah.
So thank you for all those ideas. I particularly love the phenology circle. That's just such a beautiful idea. But I was wondering, you mentioned, oh, here we go. Here's your Instagram. And but if you have any links to any of the resources you mentioned, you could email them to me, and then participants who showed up today or who weren't able to show up today will get a follow-up email, and they can click on those resources.
I'll do that.
So let's see. We have a question. Where do we look for the phenology info coming up next Tuesday?
You can, a bunch of different places, but probably the best place would be if you check out Maine Outdoor School's social media, which is up on the screen right now. If you have Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, we're going to post those up there first. They will eventually be linked to through Maine Outdoor School's website, but it'll probably take a little bit longer to get them there. So any of those links you currently see on your screen, you can get to that through there. I also noticed somebody mentioned Bernd Heinrich as well as a naturalist writer, and I totally agree. If you're a person, especially who enjoys the sort of nitty-gritty of counting things and analyzing things really closely, he could be a really good fit for you. I remember I think it was A Year in the Maine Woods, there's this particular section where he sucked up all the cluster flies in his cabin and then counted every single one of those cluster flies. And it was just like, I felt like it just typified how his amazingly genius brain works, where he just dives in and just wants to figure out, like, how many different types of feathers are built into this nest, or how many different plants are woven. And so if you're the kind of person who really gets into that, he's a really good fit for you.
That's awesome. Thanks, Hazel.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, any other questions out there for Hazel? Still have a few minutes left. I guess I have one in the meantime, Hazel. You may have already mentioned this, but what is the easiest way to access your YouTube channel? Would it be going to your Maine Outdoor School website? or
Oh, good
Facebook,
question.
or just Googling it?
Just Maine Outdoor School. Maybe that would work. I can also share that link with you so that everybody gets it. Yeah, directly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, I have like the little hand feature, and my screen I think is a little bit messed up because it's like moving around my screen. But I don't know where it's coming from.
That's funny.
So I apologize if somebody's raising their hand and I can't actually tell. All right. Well, if you have any last minute questions, you can put them in the chat box or try and raise your little hand and I will try and see it.
We've got one from Molly for you, Hazel.
Oh, cool.
Let's see. It says, Heidi and Sadie here from California. Any suggestions for nature studies in large cities? We do not have any wild plants in our neighborhood. Oh, that's
a great
really
question.
Great question. That's
such a good question. Yeah. I think in cities, there are two things that I love to encourage people to observe. One is birds in general. And the second is actually wild plants. They creep in just about everywhere. And so really trying to figure out where there are plants growing, like cracks in the sidewalk. It's always amazing to me in cities where plants will start to come up in the first crack in any pavement the moment they have the opportunity. So having a chance to actually compare, like, sidewalks with a bunch of cracks in them versus sidewalks with none. And you could do a really interesting math project where you could compare the amount of plants just in general, or the species of plants, if you really want to dive deep into different areas where there are cracks. And of course, once there are plants in cracks, those cracks are going to get bigger. And so it'll grow over time and is one of the ways plants are always trying to survive. So that's one that I think is cool. Similarly, things like, and I know you guys are in Southern California, I believe, and I'm not super familiar with the lichens there, but looking for things like lichens on the sides of buildings, especially the sort of cooler, shadier sort of sides of buildings, or mosses is another thing to look for. So you could develop your own kind of scavenger hunt in a city to look for things like lichens, different plants, mosses, growing on the sides of buildings, in sidewalk cracks, that kind of thing. And with birds are a really cool opportunity too. Like I know right now in Maine, the hummingbirds have just returned. And so we have a hummingbird feeder out our window, and it can be really fun to watch those. So if you have the opportunity to put up something like a hummingbird feeder, or I don't know if you're in an apartment building where you maybe don't have a yard, but like you can get suction bird feeder for your windows where you're able to see it, like right where you always sit and have breakfast or something. And that also creates a really good nature study observation opportunity where you can compare what birds are visiting your feeder, what types of food at different times of day, that kind of thing. So yeah, those are a few ideas.
Also, Heidi and Sadie, thank you for tuning in from California. That's amazing.
Yeah.
We had another question from Brianna.
Cool.
She loves the idea of graphing shadow length over time, especially since it would be an accessible activity for students in urban areas. There's a graphing app and tool on one of the virtual teaching platforms that you have used. That is super like user friendly. Anything
that's a good question. I haven't used a virtual teaching platform for graphing in particular, but what I have done is I've created my own template, both for data collection, the data collection phase where it's basically like date, time, length of shadow, what was your shadow notes, that students could either download onto an iPad or computer, or print it out, or create themselves on paper if they wanted to, really easy to replicate for that part. And similarly, one for the graphing experience as well. So it could be downloaded. And so I can send out an email after this to the links to those so that folks could use those if they wanted to.
That'd be great.
Sure.
We had a suggestion from the chat box from Rita. She took a class where they concentrated on the same square foot and they observed it over time. And then they actually did some digging within that area. And it was a great way to, exercise the observation of just one specific space.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think that brings up a really important point for nature learning, is that there are two things that we as humans don't tend to do a lot of. One is look up, and two is lift stuff up. And so I think we're often just like walking through, either just like looking right at our feet or straight ahead. And sometimes some of the most amazing discoveries come because you lifted up a rock or a log to see what's under there. Though in places like California where there are venomous snakes, that might not be recommended, but in Maine, that's a pretty safe thing to do. And also looking up to see like what kind of birds are up in the trees, that kind of thing. I used to do a program where I would hide up in a tree in this sort of maze, and students would have to come and find me, and there was only one tall tree in this whole maze that I was in, and they wouldn't look up. And so usually I would go through different phases, where the next phase, if they weren't finding me and they were right under me, is I would have a spray bottle of water and I would just gently spray them in their faces. And then they sometimes still would not look up or say like, oh, a squirrel must be peeing on me, and run away without just looking up, because they would have seen me right there. Third phase is I would do something like hoot like an owl really loudly in the middle of the day, for them to be like, owls shouldn't be active right now, in hopes that they would look up. And usually between the water and the owl, they would eventually look up, but it's really not a natural instinct for us. And so it's a good one to try no matter where you are, to really see what cool things happen when you look up, like maybe bird nests. So the bird nest I found yesterday was a ground nesting bird though. So I was staring at the ground like humans usually do, but I still found a nest.
That's great. And Rita also shared with us, Hazel, that she dropped a shout out to the Schoodic Educational Research Center. Yeah. And they're doing a lot of work with, especially with the youth over there. So thanks so much for your participation, Rita.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're great.
So we're just about at 5 o'clock. If anybody's got any last minute questions, I think, Lander, we can hang around for a minute or two, and please drop that in the chat box. But in the meantime, Hazel, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
It's very fun. Whenever I do things like this, I also am like more inspired to try more of my own ideas on my own rather than just with my students. So that's good.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm so grateful, Hazel. I know that we've been trying to coordinate a collaboration with your school for quite some time now. So I'm really excited that we got something together, even if it's not out in the field as we had planned. But hopefully there'll be more of that in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I love it. I love what you guys are doing. And I always get really motivated when I come to a school to do programs to take them to their local preserve, because a lot of folks in the area don't often know about the cool trails that are right around them and what cool learning opportunities they can provide. So that's something that Maine Outdoor School does a lot of, is getting kids to their local preserves, and adults.
That's awesome.
But yeah, well, thank you guys for having me, and I will send you a bunch of those links so folks will have access to those different resources that I mentioned right after this. And let me know if you have questions. You can easily get in touch with me through Maine Outdoor School's website, maineoutdoorschool.org, and just click contact and it sends me an email. So, yeah, awesome. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Hazel, and I will send you a recording, and if anyone wants to share this recording with friends and families, it will also be available on our social media, both Blue Heritage Trust and Island Heritage Trust, and potentially Moss as well. And you can also email me if you have any questions. Stay tuned for next Thursday. We have another webinar coming up at 4 p.m. live that you can register for. It's called Sustainable Foraging with Bridget Doherty. She's the founder of the Solidago School of Herbalism on Deer Isle. So we're looking forward to next week as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Hazel.
Yeah, thank you all. Have fun outside.
Take care.
Well.